I think we don't give enough credit to the Vietnam War in terms of how much it has shaped American consciousness in the decades since it ended. And in that same way, we don't give enough credit to the real reason we went to war in Vietnam in the first place. The sort of popular understanding of why we went to war in Vietnam is that it was the domino theory. We were afraid, if the United States doesn't intervene in Vietnam, in South Vietnam, and all of Vietnam falls to communism, then Thailand will fall, Cambodia will fall. It'll just be a domino effect, and all of Southeast Asia will fall, and then potentially more countries. It'll just continue falling to communism unless the West steps in and sets up a roadblock there in South Vietnam and stops the whole thing from happening. But that's not really the root cause. And I find that very few people actually know what the root cause of this conflict was. And that is, of course, that the origins of the conflict, the American involvement in the conflict in Vietnam, is the fear in post-World War II Europe of France falling to communism. It wasn't originally about Southeast Asia. It was about France. It was about the fear that France, in the post-war political environment, there were some legitimate reasons for the Western powers, the other Western powers, to fear that France would go communist. And obviously ultimately that didn't happen, but at the time it was not an unreasonable concern. It was not an unreasonable fear. There were reasons to think that might happen. France was in a vulnerable position after World War II. There was there's widespread unrest, and there were economic pressures. There was a growing communist movement in France after World War II. And the front lines of the Cold War were very nearby. I mean, Eastern Europe. It's not that much of a stretch. It might seem preposterous looking back on it now to think that France would have joined the Soviet bloc, or become a communist power, independent communist power, or whatever would have happened. It may seem silly now, like we can look back now and say, well, okay, obviously that wasn't a super realistic fear. That wasn't, that didn't happen. It wasn't ultimately as much of a threat as it seemed at the time. We can say that easily now, but in that post-World War II environment, that's, it seemed like it might happen. It didn't seem totally unreasonable. And so the reason that the United States got involved in Vietnam was to help France. It was to try to shore up, the French national character and the French national pride, try to preserve at least some of the French colonial empire, and in so doing, try to shore up French nationalism. Try to prevent communist influences from overtaking France. Try to minimize the appeal that communist influences were having on the French people in that post-war climate. And so France wanted to hold on to French Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia. Was Laos considered? I think Laos is considered a part of French Indochina. I don't recall whether Thailand was considered part of French Indochina or not, but it doesn't really matter. The French wanted to retain as much of their colonial empire post World War II as they could. And this is when the British were sort of in the process of decolonizing. They were a bit more, the British were more realistic about it, in that they realistically acknowledged we can't, we are in a greatly weakened state. The age of our empire in its current form is over, and the British were more pragmatic about being willing to seek the most, like the resolution that was best for them, which is to, in an orderly, equitable way, sort of, grant, dominion and then later Commonwealth status to their former colonies, and grant independence where the colonies didn't want to retain further closer ties with Britain, with Great Britain. But it just essentially contract and recognize that they couldn't maintain an iron grip on their empire the way they could in the past, and maintain a degree of hegemony with the sort of new form that their empire took in the Dominion and the Commonwealth era. And so the British were more realistic about it, and ultimately that that profited them, because they didn't waste nearly as much time futilely grasping onto their empire the way the French did. The French were not willing to let go of their empire as easily. In French Indochina, they wanted to hold on to it. They were not willing to seek a solution that did not involve just continued French domination, just remaining part of, or, I suppose, remaining essentially de facto under total French control. That was, the French were not willing to do that. And so the United States stepped in and was assisting the French because the United States feared France going over to communism. They feared the fall of France to communist influence. We, the United States, didn't really care about Indochina. We didn't really care about Southeast Asia in that time. It was not relevant. That's not where our focus was. We didn't really care about Indochina or Vietnam, or the danger of those regions falling to communism at that time did not seem very important. What was very important was the idea that France might fall. That would have been disastrous. That would have been disastrous for the Western powers post-World War II. That would have been a catastrophe if France had joined the communist bloc in any way. That would have been terrible. And so, strategically terrible. And so, it was the reason that, because I think it's interesting, I feel like most people don't really know this, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, who were the revolutionaries who fought against the Japanese, they fought against the French. They're the origins of what would later become communist Vietnam, North Vietnam, and then unified communist Vietnam after the war. The Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh, they originally sought closer relationships. They sought a potential alliance with the United States. There was, Ho Chi Minh was very friendly to the United States post World War II. When he was seeking independence, seeking to liberate Vietnam from the French, Ho Chi Minh wanted to be friends with the United States. He reached out to us. He wanted our friendship. He wanted to forge relations with the West. He was, which isn't to say that he didn't have communist influences or anything at that point, but he was not anti-Western per se. He was anti-French. He wanted to get rid of the French. He did not have an issue necessarily with other Western powers per se, and he was not a dyed-in-the-wool communist fanatic yet. He was, he was not like closely allied with any other, with the communist powers post World War II. he just wanted, Ho Chi Minh just wanted ultimately, and that's another thing I think is interesting that people don't necessarily think about, is that Ho Chi Minh really just wanted an independent, unified Vietnam. Like that's all he cared about. That was his goal, his entire life, his entire adult life, was just liberating Vietnam from foreign occupation and establishing a unified, independent, sovereign Vietnamese state. That was his goal. And everything he did was ultimately in service of that. And I think that's what made him a highly effective leader, and ultimately, posthumously led to the triumph of his life's ambitions. I mean, it was because he was very smart and capable and charismatic, and he was genuinely sought the freedom, or, well, perhaps not freedom, but the independence. He sought the independence of his country. And that's, he was a patriot. Like, first and foremost, he was a patriot. He was also a communist, and he also, he was a patriot first and foremost. And the United States squandered the opportunity to secure an alliance with Ho Chi Minh and make an independent Vietnam a U.S. ally, because we probably could have. Like, if we had the benefit of foresight back then, we could have easily played it differently, not supported the French, supported Ho Chi Minh, and, sort of coerced the French into withdrawing from Vietnam willingly, and we could have established an independent Vietnamese state that would have been very good friends with the West. We could have easily cultivated relations with the Viet Minh and with Ho Chi Minh, and we could have, changed the whole future of that region by just being friendly with them and helping them out, and making the independent Vietnam an extremely pro-Western state. And I think that, that would have been better in hindsight, but at the time, no one realized that. And it's not because they were stupid. It's not because they were foolish. They were operating, and that's kind of my point, is that it's easy to look back on the origins of this conflict and say, oh, well, why did, how foolish it was of us to get involved in Vietnam, how foolish it was to fight that war, how foolish it was to just get involved in this conflict that had nothing to do with us. But that's the thing. We did think it had something to do with us, because we thought we had to back up the French. We thought we had to support the French. We thought we were afraid of the French turning to communism. At that point, it didn't seem relevant about Vietnam in and of itself. Indochina, French Indochina, didn't seem important at all. It was just this backwater, in this corner of the world that was not strategically super relevant at that moment. France was super relevant at that moment, and so obviously we focused on France, and it was kind of like and it wasn't unreasonable. It was a sensible thing to do in that moment. It made sense in that moment. It's just, ultimately, with the benefit of hindsight now, obviously we see we made the wrong choice, and it led to a total national disaster. It was a terrible. It just resulted in a national humiliation and a catastrophe. But at that time, it didn't seem like that was necessarily what was going to happen. We had every reason. The people in charge had every reason to think that they were doing the right thing. They thought they were betting. They also thought, strategically speaking, in Indochina, they obviously thought they were backing the stronger party. They didn't think the French would just, be driven out. They didn't think Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh could overpower the French, but they did. It seemed like the safe bet to wager on the French being victorious, but that's not what happened. They they messed it up, and they couldn't, they had no real support in Indochina. And ultimately they were just driven out by guerrilla warfare and lack of will to fight on the part of the French. And so obviously that was like the seed of it. That was the seed of everything that happened after that. Was the United States backed the wrong player in Vietnam, in Indochina, for the right reasons. Just at that time, the reasoning was perfectly sound. Backing the French made perfect sense. But in retrospect, it was the wrong, it was the wrong decision. Like, obviously that blew up in our faces, and that was the wrong choice, but it seemed like the right choice at the time. It wasn't that the American leadership was foolish or anything like that. They had every reason to think that they were doing the right thing, and every reason to believe that they were making the wise, forward-thinking choice. The important thing in that moment was backing up France, shoring up French pride, trying to stop their empire from collapsing completely, and in so doing, minimize the threat of a potential communist takeover of France from within. And obviously, France didn't go communist, and that was not something, because even with the with the humiliations of their loss of empire over time, France didn't go communist, which is good. That would have been a disaster, but it was, so obviously, in hindsight, fears of that were not necessarily founded, but it seemed like it at the time. It was a reasonable concern at the time because of the magnitude of the consequences of making the wrong choice in that moment. At least that's how it seemed. They were terrified of the consequences of making what they perceived to be the wrong choice at that time, if they didn't support France and France fell to communism. That's what they were concerned about. But without realizing it, they accidentally did make the wrong choice by supporting France, and then that choice rippled through the future and led to the worst, pretty much the worst possible outcome for the West and for the United States in Indochina and Vietnam, because it just resulted in decades of failure to prevent a fully unified, independent Vietnam, and it resulted in that Vietnam being staunchly communist and anti-Western, being allies with the Soviet Union and communist China. I mean, that's something, just a tangent. I think it's fascinating how Ho Chi Minh was not really ever a slave to either of these larger communist powers. He was very clever. He played them off against each other for support. He was never beholden to either one. He was, because, as I said, he was a Vietnamese patriot first and foremost. That's what he wanted, what was best, at least in his estimation. I mean, I'm certainly not saying Ho Chi Minh was a good man or anything like that. He committed all sorts of terrible crimes, and he was like, ethically speaking, he was not someone I would want as a leader. But just pragmatically speaking, I think I would want him as a leader, just in terms of, he got things done. He was very competent, very clever, and he got what he wanted in the end. I think that's, ultimately he won. It was, it took longer than his lifetime, but after he died, people carried his vision through, and he won. He defeated, the empires of the world, and he got his independent, unified Vietnam. And, so he essentially had a complete victory. It just took a long time, and it could have been spoiled easily if the United States had done things differently in the Vietnam War, that could have easily been prevented. But that's a conversation for another time. I would like to talk about that in another video also. I'd like to talk about what happened in the American portion of the Vietnam War, of American involvement in Vietnam. But I think it's fascinating that I've always been fascinated by the Vietnam War since I was like a young teenager, and this is one of the things I think is most interesting, is just the idea that ultimately the West, or the United States anyway, got involved in Vietnam because of the French. It wasn't like I think the popular imagination holds an idea more that we got involved in Vietnam just directly to try to stop communism in Southeast Asia. That's kind of the like the domino theory and all that is very very influential, I think, in the popular imagination as it pertains to American involvement in Vietnam. And I mean, obviously that's the reason we stayed in Vietnam. That is the main reason we stayed in Vietnam, but not the reason we got involved in the first place. The reason we got involved in the first place was to try to protect the French, try to protect French pride, and try to make the French feel more confident and secure in their national pride, so that they wouldn't fall apart and become communist. And that just, that got us involved in this quagmire that obviously had catastrophic repercussions, and it continues to today. I mean, how much of the ills of today's America stem from all the nonsense, all the divisions in our society that were cultivated during our involvement in Vietnam? I think it was a lot. I think we suffered wounds that are not necessarily psychic wounds, that are not necessarily acknowledged or understood broadly. If we had never gotten involved in Vietnam, we would probably be a lot better off. Or if we had done the in retrospect wise thing and just supported Ho Chi Minh, made him a good friend and close ally. I mean, we could have, that would have been hugely beneficial, probably. Obviously, it's hard to say. A billion different things could have happened if we had taken this different course. Who knows? But I think, having a pro-Western, non-communist, unified Vietnam would have been a huge strategic benefit, and could have changed the whole course of history in that region. Having a U.S. ally that close to China, right next to China, it could have changed everything. I think the moral of the story, as I interpret it, is that it is so easy to be focused on the wrong thing at any given moment that we can disregard what really, and we can't always know this. Just like, I'm not saying it was foolish of the Americans of the post-war period to back the French. It made sense. I'm sure it made perfect sense to them, and they were smart men, and they were taking what they thought was the safe and sensible course. But that's the thing, is that we can so easily take what we think is the safe and sensible course without considering every little detail and every possible permutation of future events, and we can make terrible blunders because we can back the wrong party in a fight. We can value the wrong thing or the wrong people. We can lose sight of what the shape the future is going to take, because we're fixated on the current balance of power today. We're thinking about, okay, how are things arranged today? We're thinking about how is the chessboard arranged in this moment, and not what is it going to look like in the future. And so we can lose sight of things. We can miss great opportunities like making Ho Chi Minh our ally. And so it's, and obviously there's not necessarily anything we can do about that, because we can't know everything. We can't predict everything. So, we're going to make terrible mistakes. We can only We can only operate off of the information we have and the understanding that we have in a given moment. And ultimately, there's not. That's just the nature of human existence. But so it's not like we can just solve this problem, or we can look at mistakes in the past like this and say, oh, okay, we'll just avoid that mistake in the future. That's not how it works. We will make these mistakes, and we will continue to make these mistakes, because that's just, it's just part of being human. But I think we can try to be aware of these kinds of things, these potentials for mistakes, and we can maybe prevent them sometimes. Maybe we can prevent these mistakes and miscalculations from occurring as often as they otherwise would have if we weren't thinking about it and we weren't aware of it at all.